Welcome to the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast, the only show that dares to be both on topic and typically on location. Each time we meet, we bring together a group of IT luminaries to discuss a single concept. In this episode, we're tackling open source business models, or the lack thereof. But before we begin, let's meet our panel.
Hi, I'm Alex, the founder of OpenFAS and Inlets, and I'm also a CNCF ambassador in my spare time.
Hey, I'm Larry Smith. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Ellie Smith Jr. I am a senior DevOps engineer and automation architect, whatever. And I'm a huge fan of open source. So this conversation is going to be a lot of fun. So,
my name is Calvin Hendricks Parker. I am CTO and co-founder of a Python and cloud consulting company called 6 Feet Up, based out of the Midwest. Also a huge fan of open source. I've been involved in open source governance for projects such as the Plone Foundation. So I'm excited to talk further.
Hi, I'm Athar Baig. I'm an enterprise solution architect with Rackspace Limited. Been around for a bit, for 25 years or so in IT. Mainly deal with infrastructure, so it's an interesting topic for me as well.
Hi, my name is Joep. Find me on Twitter at Jepiskar. Open source is something I enjoy looking at from afar. And also, sometimes a little closer. So let's dive into it.
So I've been involved in this IT space for a long time. I got the gray hairs to prove it. I was one of the people that got Linus Torvalds' message about his new invention so many years ago and tried it out when I was back in college. And ever since then, I've been watching this whole thing. There's the push and pull between free as in speech and free as in beer. There's the open source business model and all these companies that have tried to come up with an open source business model that's doable. I think that the gold standard is Red Hat, which is now IBM, I think. And frankly, not everyone can be Red Hat. In fact, what we found over the last 20 years is not anyone can be Red Hat except Red Hat. So what is the business model for open source? And that's one of the things that I want to put to this panel, and especially to Alex, because Alex Ellis, you are actually responsible for two wonderful open source projects that I've got a super open source project crush on, OpenFAS and Inlets. And what is the current state of affairs when it comes to business models for open source projects?
Yeah, I think that really got to start by looking at how have we done this up to now. And there's four main ways that people contribute to open source. The first way is the most popular, most widespread, which is as a side gig. You have a well-paying job, you're a cloud architect somewhere perhaps, or an engineer designer. You've got this time when you get home and you do a bit of work on the side. Maybe you contribute to OpenFAS, you write a guest blog. It gives you a taste. If you get too far into that, it can start to feel like a second job. Or it can actually, as in my experience of open source originally, it can make you feel like more satisfied in a job that maybe doesn't stretch you that much. And we do see that quite a lot in the community. The second one is you get hired by a company. VMware does this a lot. AWS do it as well, because they have an interest in a project. They want more influence in Kubernetes. They need more seats in a vote. I think somewhere like VMware has got like almost the most Kubernetes engineers after somewhere like Google working for them. And their job is usually work on upstream. And so that's the way of working full time. But you've got all of that entrenchment of being in a company. You don't get to work on what you want. But maybe it's a bit of a halfway house. Now, if you look at Docker that was in the news recently about the Docker Hub, they have this way of, we'll do everything for free. We'll figure out a business model later on. Minio seem to be taking a similar approach. And actually, that's kind of a mix of what I did, except those companies had a lot of VC funding to back that up and to grow it. Finally, where I am today, the last 18 months, I've been building a software and consulting company and trying to find a way to actually fund this. Because if you've not got daddy IBM paying your wages, you've got to do that yourself. And so I'm consulting on brand, on cloud, and all sorts of things. And then some companies also had success with SaaS, right? So they operate it for you, but that then does involve some closed source pieces. And that's a good summary, I think, of what is available today and what we've already been trying.
Yeah, I appreciate that because you're in an unusual position of having worked in a variety or a number of these different, kind of business models and trying to make them work. And I think that this has been the challenge for open source projects. I'm going to throw it to Larry next. I mean, you're kind of on the user side of these things. What has been your experience trying to use these things and trying to, give money to somebody?
Alex brings up a lot of good points, right? And this is something that it's painful, not even from a user, but let's take it from the user perspective first. Being that I've been a huge fan of open source and consumed it for 20 plus years, I think I might have approached it different than most users, because I think most users of consumers of open source, they just say it's free, it's open source, it's blah, 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 I can use it. But damn it, if it breaks, I'm going to raise hell. I'm going to go to the project page. I'm going to flame them with things are broke, but I'm not going to contribute back to make it better or to help out. I think that's one thing that is you see over time. That's a huge problem. The other part of it is I think you have another set of users that may be in a company that are themselves want to try to monetize off of what others are doing, if that makes sense. So I think there's a lot of business opportunity there, but at the end of the day, you really should reach out to someone like Alex and get a partner engagement so you can help fund him and what he's putting his work into. And then the last part I want to add is that myself, that I contribute a ton around mostly Ansible, so automation, things like that, but also I have Python projects and things like that I contribute to GitHub, and I've been doing it for years. And I get zero out of that. I don't get any funding or anything like that. And I'm cool with that. But what I rely on is the feedback to make sure that things move along good and et cetera. But I've been in the scenario of, hey, we're using your stuff, and you don't know this until you run into an issue. And we talked about this earlier on the other podcast, and this is where Alex was going, is that like Travis CI. So you get these integrations and you get the Dependabot that finds a vulnerability and you get spam. So all these builds are kicking off. But what you find out is that, hey, something has broken the build, and you get flamed again because you find out that, hey, a massive organization, somebody like a Red Hat, an EMC, or someone like that is using your code. And the next thing you know, you're getting hit up and they're like, hey, why doesn't this work anymore? So I've seen it from every area. So I'll add that for now.
Yeah, I was going to chime in on the bit with the open source models. And there's some subtleties in there in the ways I've used open source and the way I've participated in open source projects in the past. Is that there's also good open source projects that have foundations. I think you'd mentioned that there's like open source projects may get an engineer from a company, but I think what's more important is if an open source project gets a foundation and then there's a vehicle for participating in governance, participating in code, donating money, and then there's actually a way for organizations to officially give back into those groups. That I think if you're just a solo code person, you don't have a governance model, a big enterprise is going to have a hard time, just getting thousands of dollars your way in an easy fashion. They need a vehicle or a mechanism to do it, and they need to know that there's some kind of protections around the IP and the license and all these other things. The ways I've participated in the past have been, serving on the boards of these open source foundations, obviously contributing code back into these various projects, and not being one of these complainers who just flames the issue board, but I make concerted efforts to put in a pull request with tests and documentation because that's being a good open source citizen. And how do you encourage those kinds of good behaviors? I know it's not kind of the main premise, which is how do we make money with open source, but I think we're talking about how do we keep open source sustainable so we can still have the nice things and benefit from it, as a global group of awesome projects and people.
So I'll take a slightly different perspective on this. Like I used to work at an end user organization, a supermarket, where we used open source left and right, but we didn't use open source software because we had a conviction that we had to or we needed to. It was just whatever was easiest, the lowest friction for our developers to start using. that's what we used, right? If we could prevent having a developer go into the purchasing department and having to figure out how to actually purchase this piece of software, if we could prevent that, that was better developer productivity. And I'm kind of, making the situation worse than it was in reality, of course. But I see open source being kind of used in those scenarios and kind of as a misnomer for your own internal bureaucracy. That, I think it's good to separate, open source from a consumer perspective. Like, I'm a developer for a company. I need to solve my problem. I'll have a preference for open source, mostly because it's free. And then the other perspective is the open source community having a conviction that open source is actually better for all of us, right? The greater good. And I think, and I'm curious as to what you think about this, that these two perspectives are being intermingled and mixed all the time, making it a very hard discussion to, basically get anywhere.
Yeah, I think my perspective again is a similar one, that open source, it's for the greater good. And yeah, obviously, whenever people start contributing to that, that is born out of love, basically, and love of the community, love of the development side of things, which is why most of those projects start in that way. Now, it's human nature, however. First of all, one has to feed themselves and the family. So there is only so much that you can do with that. And as a hobby, you can actually sustain it. But how do you then build a system which will then be backed by or adopted by, first of all the developers, and then be sustainable to be able to support it long term? And then we talked about Red Hat, obviously, who have famously made that model work. But there has to be some sort of a financial subscription or something like that. Now, some companies actually do that. So their free version will be less feature rich. And then as you go further, and it becomes more supported options become available with payment. But first of all, you have to get to that level of, say, spread, or companies start using it. There has to be a critical mass before you can start doing those kind of things. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's just that you need a bigger group of people to be able to start and to get to that point where you can offer subscriptions. And usage of technology becomes more common before you can do that. So it becomes a chicken and egg problem, I think, and that's probably the bigger issue. If we move away from open source, for example, and take an example of, say, Facebook, that was to start with, it was all free. But it didn't really take off until it started monetizing its services. And then it suddenly grew quite a lot. Same goes for other companies as well. I think Google is pretty much in the same situation. It started all free and then they started monetizing. So you have to get to that stage. And I think the problem is this: how do you get to that stage before you can start charging for subscription and make it sustainable and supportable?
As Stephen said, I've got personal experience with this. Here's how I see it, as actually having created probably 4 or 5 projects with well over 1,000 GitHub stars, commercial users, hundreds of blog posts, the works. It starts with scratching an itch. The developer has a problem, has an idea, and they scratch the itch enough to write some code. They see that it's useful, they publish it, they get some endorphins from that, they get some GitHub stars, then they start to build a community. Once a community is built up, you see more and more adoption, as Atta is saying. That adoption gets to a point where the tool that you've built is way bigger than your capacity to maintain it on the side, right? And then sustaining that becomes very difficult, because you're now at a point where commercial companies have built products on top of it. They may be saving or making millions of dollars, but they don't want to give you any of that. With OpenVAS Limited, there is a company there. And we do have a premium subscription, getting more and more interest in that. But it's still difficult for companies to understand that if something's free, why should they pay for it? Right? However, you sort of enumerate the benefits of having someone to call, of if something goes wrong and having influence over the roadmap, they might just be happy because it's free. And that's something that I've seen more and more. So with Inlets, that came along, one of the later projects I built, I said, right, well, it started off exactly the same, and I was going down the same path of, eventual implosion. And I said, okay, well, I want these features. I'm going to build them and I'm going to keep them to myself. And then I made it available for purchase. And there's been some interest, and a bunch of people have purchased that and are using it and are quite happy with it. And actually, the people that have paid are way less demanding than the people that are using it because it's free. And so I didn't know how to price this. So I went to Redgate, have this book, Don't Just Roll the Dice of Software Pricing. And they say that there's this curve. And as you start charging more than $0, you lose a whole bunch of your users that were only using you because you were free. And we're never going to pay for support, never going to be a customer, and never going to want your help. And it's really just a case of, I think the Docker Hub is going to see this as well, is once you get more than free, you've then got to kind of figure out the pricing. You then get anchored to other products like, how is this better than ngrok? Or why would I pay you $30 a month when theirs is only 15? And then it's very difficult and it becomes a whole different game. And what it's taught me is that, because I've done a lot of reading around businesses and MBAs and creating product, is that almost if you want to make it alone and you want to have an element of open source, you almost have to go the opposite way and start from the very beginning with, okay, what's the product? How many people are willing to pay for that? What are they going to pay for that? And of that amount, is that enough for me to have the lifestyle that I want, or to grow the business where I want to grow it? Anything else other than that I just don't think is sustainable. And then it will either be done through open core, fully closed source, maybe a SaaS. I know a lot of us have been in the industry a very long time, but over the last 5 years, I've seen a lot of micro SaaS products jump up. And this is where somebody goes through that mini cycle of figuring out what the product is, experimenting, and then selling it. And there's a guy, his name's Matthias, he's from Belgium. He's got a newsletter called Cron Weekly, and he has sold something that checks your DNS records. He's making about 8,000 euros a month. Not a lot of money, way more than I make from OpenVAS, from sponsors. And it's all on his own, and it's not open source, and people love it. Even big companies use it.
I had that idea ages ago for DNS insurance. I never seized the opportunity.
So I think it's not how can we make open source sustainable? Like it's the opposite of a business. No CFO in their right mind will tell you, give everything away for free and have no motivation to pay. And it's just taken me many years and lots of sunk costs to get to the point that I realized that if you want a company to pay, you have to make them pay. I don't mean that in a bad way, but we've talked about holding features back, offering things like support, offering custom development. Unless it's there, it's not going to pay. That's my take on it.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting angle too, is this kind of question. I think that a couple of you guys have gotten to this sort of push and pull between, okay, so do we do like a freemium business model where there's like the free version, and then if you want the cool features, then you pay? Or is there, or do we just give everything away and charge for support? I mean, this gets back to the business models that Alex was talking about at the beginning. And I mean, frankly, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because it is a chicken and the egg. If you don't give people the cool features unless they pay, then they are not going to use the cool features, and then they're not going to become reliant on them, and then they're not going to pay. And it's like, but yet at the same time, hello, Alex deserves to pay his rent, right?
Yeah, but I think there's good ways to handle this. I mean, you mentioned the open core model, which I'm not a big fan of, but mostly because I think a lot of companies do it incorrectly. If you look at something like Alfresco, the open core model of that was you always got a version behind. You never got the latest version of that code. If you wanted any support from any partner Alfresco company, you had to be on a licensed version of this Alfresco product. Versus if you look at SaltStack, SaltStack was not open core. It was an truly open source product. They offered services and support, and then they had an enterprise version of SaltStack. But the enterprise version of SaltStack had the exact same feature set as the open source version of SaltStack, except they put a GUI control plane, fanciness on top of it. And I think it benefited them, and with goodwill with the community, they got lots more open source contributions, because there's no way I'm contributing to something where if I was an open source user only, I can't even get my own commits to the code back because I'm not on the latest version because I didn't pay a license fee. I really prefer to be an open source contributor to your project versus paying. for license. So be careful with the open core models. Produce a portion that gives you that value. And I think, Alex, you mentioned earlier with your Endlets project that I really liked the approach you were talking about. I don't know if you wanted to mention that.
Yeah, so it's the first time doing it. And I say the first time because the actual first time was an enterprise login SSO for OpenFaaS, where rather than using your basic auth strategy, you're using SSO. And I didn't market it very well. And since I started marketing it as part of a built-in subscription, I had like a few dozen companies ask about it. But that was my first false start. And my second one was was Inlets Pro. Inlets originally was an NGBOT replacement. That was the only thing it was meant to do. And to get you unlimited exit servers and IP addresses and what have you, and to be able to expose your local development environment. I then got to the point where I wanted to expose my Ingress controller or Nginx and actually have TLS certificates served off my computer in my house. And for that, I needed TCP. I needed 443 and 80 to go out. And I also wanted SSH, for similar reasons. I thought, well, this is going to take me 3 weeks to build, and it did. Why should I give away 3 weeks of engineering time? Like, to a client, what would that cost on a day rate? And it may never recoup the costs anyway. But I said, no, it's not going to be free. You have a free trial, and then you can buy it if you want to. There's a cheap price for individuals like us, and that's mostly where sales have been. And there's a slightly higher price per month for companies, but that includes support. So far, it's going pretty well. The point that I took was, it's TCP or HTTP. And actually, I think I've done it wrong, because so many people are like, I'm fine with the free one. It is exactly what we need. And so I'm starting to think about, well, what if there was one in between? It's like the free one, it has a bit more. You're not paying for stuff that you couldn't do yourself with Caddy or with some other tool, but you've got the convenience. Is the convenience of me saving you 3 hours of your time worth $200 a year? It should be, if you calculate your hourly rate, if you're in IT. But people don't necessarily think that way.
Yeah.
Yep, 100%.
Let me add one thing from a perspective of tool versus product. Is the problem, because I've been a part of these conversations that are similar to this, right? You build the tool. So we build the tool because, and this is not to take anything away from Alex, but when I listen to this, I'm thinking about Inlets and I'm thinking about OpenFaaS and things like that. Is it the perception that this is a tool or is this a product? And I think the conversation starts going to the next level is people are not willing to pay for tools, but they're willing to pay for a product. And is it that the product is actually all of the things, let's call it Alex's product. He has all these different tools that are a part of that product. They're willing to pay for the product, but they're not going to pay for each one of those things. Hopefully that makes sense. It's just, this is what I'm hearing, right?
I think that makes sense. That's something that I was told recently. Something very similar was, okay, Inlets is a technology, now build a product. And that's where I started to build this thing called Inlets Cloud, because for the companies where the free version is fine for them, they now have to build something to manage that. And they're probably going to run it on Kubernetes because that's just what everyone's doing right now. Well, that's a job and a half. It's going to take you 3 months, 3 engineers. Think of the cost. Well, we've done it. We've tested it. And we can give it to you for a fraction of that price. Yeah. And that's where it starts to become a product, and it has a REST API, auditing. We'll build a small UI on top of it as well, and maybe do team login. Yep. And I think, you got a really good point, Larry, about when does a tool or technology become a product?
Yep.
And wrapping the support, priority, backlog prioritization, and the SSO for OpenFaaS into a premium subscription has given me way more inbound leads than here's a bit in the docs if you want to do if you want to do SSO, you download this tool and pay for it.
Yeah.
So I think you want something.
And I think one of the things that you're already doing, like you were saying, that Kubernetes seems to be the thing that people seem to be doing these days for everyone. That I think also rings true for any such thing. When you have a tool of this kind or a set of tools, if they can be put together to then solve a business problem, that everyone seems to be doing or looking for, or don't know how to do themselves, or can be done easily because of your tool set. And that's when you can actually start monetizing on that basis as well, saying that, the basics of that is this, which could still be free, so that, people get the hook of it on that. But then, the full bigger suite, which then will provide the full functionality of what your vision is, that will then ring true with other people as well, and especially the collateral that goes with it, saying that, well, this is what the business problem is solving. And then obviously people start paying for it. And then obviously it can go, well, hopefully bigger and better things from there. But I think that's one of the approaches that, in product development one has to take to be able to effectively monetize it going forward.
Yeah, and to add to that real quick, it's easy for us to sit here and say, yes, we'll pay for a product, or it should be a product versus a tool thing. Again, we're talking about Alex being a sole developer. This is not something that he can put a roadmap together, but you're talking about months and months and months of work. There's got to be something. So it goes back to the whole idea, is the answer to go after VC funding. Do you spend more time on the business plan of what you're really trying to build from a product and be able to string in those different tools with a clear definition of where the end goal is? I don't know.
And if you go for VC funding, what does that do to your project? Does it screw up your project and make it not what you were trying to build? Does it,
Exactly.
they don't want you to make something that's going to conquer the world?
Yeah,
Exactly.
I have these emails on a pretty regular basis, and sometimes they come in clusters of, we're from this sort of VC company. Are you wanting to build a company? I'm like, yes, I am. I'm doing it now. And it's not what they mean. They mean, do you want to take the VC money? And it is something that will result in the ability to hire people and pay them and drive a vision. I'm actually reading Getting Real by Basecamp at the moment. The guys behind Ruby on Rails and other stuff like that. It's refreshing. It's the opposite. It's not even about open source. It says start small, stay as small as you can, only hire when you're in real pain, and that you only need 3 people to develop a product, like the first version. And the more I read it, the more it aligns with like what I want to do. Now, if we land a couple of big consulting projects, there's a couple of people I want to hire, and that will get us up to 3 pretty quickly. And I'm pretty sure that will happen. And then, that UI for Inlet's Cloud and the product around it can be built in a minimal way, get feedback from customers, show the business problem that's being solved, do similar with OpenVAS. And I think it worked for them, and they've got 8 potentially 9-figure business now, and they're doing really well. I think it can work for us as well. And I am OpenVAS Limited at the moment, but that's not my vision. My vision is to bring more people in. We're back to a chicken and egg. So I'm doing my bit, and I say, watch this space, because I think this will work. Solving a problem, having clear message about it, and meeting customers where they're at. That's what I think.
Yeah, I guess what I was going to say was that exactly that what you've just said, that in many of these products or things that you've seen in the past is basically taking one step at a time. So when you're developing something, sure, the day will come when you have a team of developers doing all of this thing. But when a company is starting up, then they start small, 2 or 3 developers, do 1-2 things, eat an elephant step by step, if you like. And as demand grows and the popularity grows, then obviously you hire that. That's probably the time to go to for VC funding as well, then, because then you've already got a proven product, I guess, but not before that, I guess, because that puts too much pressure. And like Stephen was saying, might actually take the product into a completely different direction, which is then might be against your own vision.
But to Alex, again, me coming from a computer science background years and years ago as well, you look at things completely different. You're able to break down these things. But the question I want to ask you is, when you built OpenVAS, or obviously Inlets was after that, Did you build it with the intent to sell it, or did you build it because you were trying to build the thing that solved the problem that you saw and you knew it would benefit others, and did not expect that it might turn into something that could monetize off of? And a reason I say that is because it's two different ways of looking at things, right?
Yeah. So as I sort of talked about a bit earlier, my journey has been one of going from scratching an itch. OpenVAS was Lambda and other cloud functions they're not cloud native in the same way as a container is. You can't build it on your computer, run exactly the same code in the cloud. And I wanted to do that and reuse infrastructure. That was the itch. Yeah. With Inlets, the team that I had at the time, we were an enterprise company. We couldn't use ngrok. We had to test webhooks for part of OpenVAS. And I was like, well, I'm just going to build that. And I did, and it worked. And then it took off. And in both instances, I hadn't really thought it through as a business. Yeah. But now where I am is, okay, an MBA hat on. What is the opportunity? What is the problem we're solving? What is the size of the market? What are they willing to pay? Of that, am I happy with that as a business? And that's where I'm actually reframing it now. With Inlets, there's tools that provision the little servers that give you the IP. There's two, one that goes into Kubernetes, one that goes on your computer. Both of them work with Inlets Open Source and Pro, which means that people that use the free version can come in and still experience it, and they can enhance these tools. There's still community around it, blog posts, meetings, and conference talks, right? It's not just a closed source product, but it gives it a way to play and sort of augment it, if you like.
Yeah. Good stuff.
So I'm going to give you each a chance to kind of sum up. I mean, if we can get back to the original question, when looking at open source projects, do we have a viable business model to support the development of open source projects, or do we not? Let me start. We'll go in reverse order here. Let me start with you, Joep.
I have so many nuances I want to bring to the table, but I think we haven't found a sustainable model yet.
I think it's human nature that, if people can get away with free, they will not pay for it. So I think there has to be a hook. There has to be a base product that then develops the critical mass of users and make it widely spread, and with enough features that get them into the habit of using it and liking it and talking about it. But once you get to that point, you should also you can start with the idea that to be able to monetize it right from the start, saying that, okay, this is my vision, especially not let people know about those features that are going to come up later, but then introduce them and charge them for it. And that model is the one, say freemium, but with those 2 or 3 tiers model that then gets the earning and support going, and slowly the model builds on that. And that is the model that's the viable model, I think, and many companies are already using it, I think, successfully.
Yeah, I don't believe there's one single model for these things, but I do believe in the model that Alex just put forward with his Inlets type project, that not open core, but there is a same version that everyone gets to use, and then there's going to be these things that are built on top of it that provide a lot more value. There's different use cases, different needs between that hobbyist home user and the person who needs to get a quick win, and an enterprise who wants to adopt a tool across their whole infrastructure to get a problem solved. And so I think that those kinds of problems can be solved with open source tooling, and I think that the developers who build those things can be supported through the money made from that. There's also other kinds of open source too, but I think when it comes to that specific question and that specific problem, we've not reached an exact model, and I don't think there ever will be an exact model, but I think there's lots of good options.
Yeah, I think for me, there's so many angles we can come at this. From you can come from every angle possible and tear it down. There's what, like we talked about a second ago, from a model of, I have a goal of building a product that I'm going to monetize off of, but my roadmap dictates what portions of that product I'm going to expose to the public as open source, because we all know that once you put it in open source, it does give you feedback that drives the innovation of where the product's going, and being able to think about those things that it addresses this problem today, but I'm already thinking about the other problems that it could solve down the road. Those are the things that I think from a business model perspective, you have to protect. So I'll end with that.
Yeah, and sort of as a closing thought, I feel like I've been at this from different perspectives. Maybe I've seen it from each angle, and now I'm sort of ready to admit that open source is not sustainable and it isn't a business model, and that's probably where we get ourselves tripped up. Is open source isn't a business model. It just isn't. Open source is a great thing. It's a good way of building a community and getting people to contribute. You can have a sustainable business model and you can have some open source component of that. But if you want to have a business, you've got to start with something that people are going to buy and pay money for. That's my belief. I mean, whether it's a freemium closed source thing or whatever. Do you need to have something that's open source to get traction? Well, I mentioned Basecamp. Think of GitHub itself. There's countless other products out there. If it's useful and solves a problem and is at the right price point, people will pay for it. But open source has a lot of richness it can bring. The community does, and it isn't necessarily mutually exclusive, which is something that I'm sort of learning as I experiment here and try different things out.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I agree. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I'm still not sure what the business model is for open source. I think from my perspective, if I look at my usage, I kind of go to the last thing that Alex was saying, where essentially the open source software is one thing, but then there's a service that you're paying for, whether it's a web portal or some sort of, master manager or something like that. I'm thinking of like Home Assistant with Nabu Casa. I'm thinking of, a lot of these other things out there that, what do I actually pay for? I'm going to pay for the service. I'm not going to pay for the software. And, maybe that's my problem, but I guess that's how I'm approaching it. So I really appreciate your time, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this really interesting episode of the On-Premise IT Roundtable. If you enjoyed this discussion, remember to subscribe, rate, and review the show in iTunes, since that really helps our visibility. And please do share this show with your friends. This podcast is brought to you by GestaltIT.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. For show notes and more episodes, go to GestaltIT.com/podcast. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.